Now let me give you a definition of capitalism. A lot of people think capitalism is free market, it's free choice, it's individualism. No. Capitalism is production for profit in private hands, as opposed to, for example, what's happening in China, where we have state capitalism, where the state produces for profit, but it's not owned in private hands. Or as opposed to production in private hands that's not made for profit. So capitalism is when production of goods and services is done for the sake of profit, and it's in private hands. Now, this is the total opposite of a market. In a market, the principle, as Marx described, is product, money, product. A farmer might go to the market with eggs, get money for the eggs, and with this money buy some milk, right? So the money is just a tool. Now, a capitalist works the other way around. It starts with money. Either you take a loan or you have money to invest. You make a product just to end up with more money than you had in the beginning. So the principle is money, product, more money, right? Now, capitalism isn't good or bad in itself. It doesn't have a moral. The point is, it doesn't have a plan. It doesn't have a responsibility. Because in every company's goal is only that thing, to end up with more money at the end. It doesn't have a responsibility for the climate, or the economy, or the country, or the world. Now the point is here that capitalism isn't the same all the time. It takes many forms. It can take the form of imperialism, as we know. It can take the form of free market type of capitalism. It can take the form of vampire capitalism, as we saw in Russia in the 90s. People are just robbing the hell out of the economy. What I'm going to try to describe here is the changes that capitalism has gone through over the last 40 years, which has brought us to this period where crises are happening one after the other in the whole world. Because capitalism doesn't always lead to crisis. As economist Andrew Kleinman has said, you cannot blame capitalism for crisis. That is as blaming plane crashes on gravity. Gravity is always there, right? But planes do not always crash. And as a matter of fact, in the post-war period, 1945 to 1973, the West didn't see a single crisis. It was a time when profits went up at the same time as salaries went up. The working classes became consuming classes for the first time in big parts of the West. Could buy TV, could buy cars, could go on vacation and things like that. Now in 73, what happened? The oil crisis. After the oil crisis, all of a sudden profits went down all over the West. Now, of course, bearing in mind that if you have a company that wants to make profits, what does a company do when they no longer can make profits? Well, one way is to go bankrupt. Another way is to cut costs. So companies all over the West started cutting costs, meaning the cost of labor, lowering salaries, which of course meant also attacking trade unions. You had to do that in order to be able to push down salaries as much as they did. They got political help in the beginning of the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher, who launched major attacks on trade unions all over Britain and America. Another strategy when profits went down was financialization. Now, as you might remember, finance had been a very repressed part of the economy since the Great Depression. Of course, because in the Great Depression in 1929, they saw what would happen if you had an unregulated financial sector. It led to a big bubble that then crashed and millions were unemployed. So after the Great Depression, they installed regulation for finance, right? Now, in the beginning of the 80s, investors were pushing for these regulations to be taken away in order to, as you remember the formula, money, product, money, to shorten this formula and make money off of money. So just money, money. That is the finance sector. So also in Britain and in America, regulations were taken away. So all of a sudden banks could lend as much as they wanted. They could have as high interest rates as they wanted. They didn't have to have a distinction between the money that people put in the bank to save and the money they use for speculation, called Glass-Steagall law was taken away as well. So this led to financial explosion, and later on when new innovations came in finance, they were totally free from regulation. The third strategy was privatization. Now this is very smart if you think about it for a capitalist, because if your product is like chewing gum, in a crisis maybe that's not the first thing that people are going to buy. It doesn't matter like if you make a new package, or if you put green tea taste, or ginger taste, or mix all these different things in your chewing gums. If people don't have money, that's not the first thing they're going to get. But if you look at the important things of life, what are these? Water, electricity, communications, health, school, education, things like that. The problem was that you couldn't make profit off of these, because these used to be owned by the state. Now capitalists all over the West said, why don't we try to get in there? Because of course, if there's a crisis, people are still going to want water. They're still going to want education. So all these sectors were privatized from the 80s and onwards, bit by bit. And I know that people here tend to think that Sweden is this kind of social democratic paradise where everything is public and we all get money for free. Let me tell you that we have actually gone further than most countries in deregulating and privatizing things. I mean, today in Sweden, you can buy a school. McDonald's can buy a school and take money off of the states, put half of it in Cayman Islands and go bankrupt. So Sweden isn't really what it used to be either. So these three strategies, combined of course with the fact that China and Soviet Union later on were included in the whole capitalist world economy, have changed a lot of things. Now what happened was in the US, they managed to put salaries so low that people in the US now needed to have 2-3 jobs to survive. How then were they going to consume the products? And that's like every capitalist dilemma, because what you want, of course, is your workers should not earn that much, so you cut costs, but the workers of all the other companies should earn a lot, ideally, so they can buy your products. Now, if all the companies succeed in pushing down wages, nobody's there to consume. So that was the problem. But then what came in? The loans. Remember the second strategy, financialization. So loans came in. So now all these people in the US working 3 jobs were told, well, you can just take loans. If you take loans, you can get a new house and so on. Don't worry, the interest rate is very low. Nobody saw that it went up after 2 or 3 years. So when all that got together, we had the breakdown that we had in 2008. Normal people in the US had each one capitalist on every shoulder. One of them, of course, is the company owner that you work for, that's, taking off of your work every day. The other one was a bank. When one of them wasn't paying enough to satisfy the needs of the other one, things broke down. Who had to step in and solve the whole thing? The taxpayers again, the same workers. Now, going back to Europe, the European industrialists had their own strategy in attacking falling profits. In 1983, the major European industrialists met in Paris of the initiative of the CEO of Volvo, Swedish guy, I don't know if I should be proud, Per. He called his colleagues up in Europe and he said, listen guys, we have a problem. European industry is going bad, Japan is going ahead of us, the US is going ahead, we need to do something. So they all met in Paris. Of course, these were all competing companies that normally would have hated each other, but now they decided to collaborate. They said the problem in Europe is we have too many different governments that decide different things, right? So we need a unit that can impose the same rules in the same market in the whole of Europe. Now before that, I don't know if you remember, we had the European Community. If you opened a newspaper in the 1970s and tried to read about the European Community, there wouldn't be anything there about it. Why? Because the European Community wasn't really that much of a thing. What it was fine words about peace and about brotherhood, agricultural subsidies, but not much more than that. Now these industrialists that met decided to develop the European Community into what is now known as the European Union. Unfortunately, they haven't really gotten credit for it, and a lot of them are writing their memoirs saying, why are are people giving credit to politicians when it was us, you know, the capitalists, we did this. Nobody's thanking us. So they wrote a manifesto back in '83 called Europe 1990 that then became the basis of the Maastricht Treaty that laid the foundation for the time of the European Union and later transformed into the euro. So we can see that the same thing happened when the American crisis came over to Europe, mutated into euro crisis, and all of a sudden the flaws of this scheme were exposed. Now I'm realizing I only have a couple of minutes here to preach like world revolution, so I don't think that's going to happen. But I want to ask you to think of something. With the crisis that we have today, the crisis of the 3 E's, economy, ecology, and energy, do you think the system will be able to solve these crises by itself? Or are there mechanisms in companies that are taking care of these things? You know, there's a famous quote, the market is a good servant, but it's a bad master, and it's a worse religion.